In this module, we're going to look at sustainability. So we're going to talk about what it is specifically and what affects it. So firstly, what is sustainability? In the past 200 years, the world's population has rocketed from 1 billion to over 7 billion in 200 years. All of these people need natural resources to live. Just like we talked about earlier, you need that food, that water, that iPhone, the plastic, whatever it is, you need these resources. But the Earth's natural resources are limited. So we're going to get to a point where we have more people than we do have resources available. And this is all to do with sustainability. So sustainability is to do with how we use a resource. Our use is sustainable if it can continue for a long time. So that is the definition of sustainability or sustainable. It's sustainable if it can be used for a long time. But that's not really a clear statement. How long is a long time? Like if I said to you, I want you to sit there quietly, 10 minutes is a long time. But if we're talking about a resource, how long do we want resources to last? How long do they need to last for us to say that they're sustainable? Usually when we talk about this, we're talking about generations. So a resource that's going to be around for your children's children's children, perhaps, we might say that's sustainable. That's a long time. But that's a pretty vague answer. So if you want your great-grandchildren to be able to use the resource, and they want their great-grandchildren to be able to use the resource, we're talking hundreds of years. So our use of resource is unsustainable if we use it up, so that ties in with that overuse, or it harms other things. So it doesn't have to necessarily be that it runs out. It could be the fact that our use of it is affecting other things. We say that's unsustainable. This graph shows us the mass of orange roughy in the wild and the mass caught. So we look at how many were caught and how many existed in the wild. We can see that it's significantly dropped off. So there used to be this huge mass of them there. Then we started harvesting vast amounts. As we caught more and more here, the population plummeted, and it got to a point where, you know, we went from 100,000 to 10,000, and then the amount that we caught started to decline, both because there weren't that many to catch, and also maybe we started to realize. So the less we caught here, then it started to climb again. So this shows that in this period we were significantly overusing this resource, and its population was dropping rapidly. Another example is recycling. So when we recycle something, we get more use out of it than what we've already taken from nature. So we have to take less from nature as a result. Metal is a great example, and aluminium in particular is a very good one. It's extremely expensive to extract aluminium from its natural resource. The aluminium ore, or bauxite as we call it, is mined, and then it's processed to form alumina. This is then heated to 1,000 degrees Celsius, and huge amounts of electricity are used to separate out the pure metal known as smelting. So that's an unsustainable process, right? That's very resource intensive. It takes a huge amount of heat, huge amount of electricity, on top of the fact we've got to mine it. So if we can recycle these resources, so we recycle our cans and our metal things, then we don't have to go through this huge process again just to get it from the natural form.
To manufacture aluminium products such as a beverage can, the aluminium industry needs to mine bauxite, process it into alumina, and then smelt it in order to make primary aluminium. In particular, the last step takes up a lot of energy. Primary aluminium is then used to manufacture the cans, which are then filled with your favorite drink and sold to you in a shop. If you simply dispose of your can, it falls out of the loop and we need to go back to the first step and reproduce what was wasted. But if you are eco-minded and collect the cans selectively for recycling, then there is no need to manufacture primary aluminium again. The used cans are the raw material for new cans, and in just about 60 days, you can have a new can on the shelves of the supermarket. Used beverage cans can also be used for the production of other valuable aluminium products, such as window frames, bicycles, or the engine block of a car. And this cycle can go on and on and on and on endlessly to save 95% of electricity and greenhouse gas emissions in each and every cycle. This means that when you dispose of a used aluminium beverage can via one of these selective collection systems, as established in most European countries, you save enough energy to power your TV or your laptop for as long as 3 hours. 95% energy saving? Yes, that's right. Compared to primary production, to manufacture alucans from recycled aluminium, we need only 5% of the original energy input. Would you join in if this would increase your pocket money by 95%? I'm sure you would. Now let's take a look at how recycling is done. Selectively collected aluminium cans arrive at the yard of the reprocessing firm. Huge compressed bales of aluminium cans are transported to the factory to be remelted. Melting furnaces are heated to around 700 degrees and can handle 500 tons of melted aluminium per day. Two and a half hours later, the result is a 10-meter-long, 27-ton slab made of 1.5 million recycled cans. Once they are ready, slabs are transported to the rolling mill. The recycled metal is indistinguishable from primary metal. This is what makes recycled aluminium so valuable.
So there you go. So you can see that 95% of energy is saved by recycling. We don't have to go through that huge process of digging it up and refining it just to get another can. If we recycle it, then we only use that 5% just to melt it back down and then remold it into some other material. So that's a form of a sustainable practice. If we dispose of it, then it would be an unsustainable practice. The second way that we can use a resource unsustainably is if we harm other things in the process. So there may be enough of the resource to last a very long time, but we judge that the harm cannot go on for a long time. There's two main types of this harm. We can have harm to the environment or the ecosystem, which includes population, destruction of habitat, and the extinction of a species. And we've also got damage to human health. So how much harm does it take before our use of a resource becomes unsustainable? Like the definition of a long time, there's no easy answer and people often disagree with this. So if I said to you, at what point is something harmful to the environment or to your health, that may differ very differently to someone else. The first example we'll look at here is palm oil. In the recent years, the Sumatran tiger, the elephant, the orangutan, and rhino species have all been driven really close to extinction. And this is all due to activities of members of the palm oil industry. Sumatra is a large island in Indonesia too, in case you didn't know. Have a look up on Google Maps. The palm oil company is not hunting these animals though. So why are their populations declining?
Oil palms. Known for the oil its fruits produce, these trees are consuming the countryside and rainforests of Indonesia and Malaysia at a shocking pace. And this massive terraforming endeavor is all happening to satisfy demand from Western countries hooked on palm oil's ability to replace more costly alternatives in products spanning from shampoos to pizza doughs. If you look closely, palm oil is everywhere. Yet, it can often disguise itself with sneaky aliases on ingredient lists. The ubiquity of palm oil has become such a hot-button issue that the European Union decided to ban subsidies of palm oil in biofuels by 2020. The oil is shrouded in controversy and skepticism, and I want to know whether the environmental impact of palm oil consumption warrants these drastic measures, and whether boycotting or banning palm oil is a reasonable solution. While palm oil often ends up in products consumed mostly in the US and Europe, the story of palm oil's environmental devastation lies rooted in Indonesia and Malaysia. Combined, these two countries satisfy 90% of the global demand for palm oil. Through a medley of small landholders and large corporations, rural land has been transformed into an oil palm monocropping factory. According to one analysis, from 1990 to 2010, 9.6 million hectares of land were converted to industrial oil palm farms in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. That being said, the makeup of the land before conversion varied widely, and as a result, the environmental impacts of this massive land transformation is contextual. One study conducted by Forest Watch Indonesia claims that while some of this deforestation is government sanctioned, almost 50% of the natural forest loss is located outside of lands zoned for logging or production. And it's this act of rapidly terraforming forest land into neat rows of oil palms that has led to a backlash against palm oil products. Not only is the loss of rainforest a problem due to the subsequent loss of the ability to sequester large amounts of carbon, but it also means the destruction of rich biodiverse habitats. And often the easiest and cheapest way to ready large swaths of forest for production is through burning. In the case of trees, this compounds the environmentally damaging act of clear-cutting by releasing large amounts of carbon into the atmosphere via smoke. Another peer-reviewed study on oil palm deforestation found that between 1990 and 2010, net carbon dioxide emissions from land use change due to oil palm plantations increased from 92 to 184 teragrams of carbon dioxide per year in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Papua New Guinea. That's an increase of the equivalent of roughly 36,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools of carbon dioxide more per year. Besides the deforestation of primary forests and rainforests, the draining and burning of peatlands in Southeast Asia has caused huge problems for the environment and atmosphere. Peatlands act like sponges for carbon dioxide, soaking up and storing large quantities of CO2 in their waterlogged, low-oxygen environments. But when oil palm producers drain these swamps and burn the remaining foliage to establish their crops, this carbon sequestration reverses and releases all of that carbon back into the atmosphere. This destructive process has led to a sharp decline of peatlands in Indonesia and Malaysia. And according to a study published in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, Southeast Asian peatlands could disappear by 2030 if the rate of oil palm farming continues. Ironically, one of the main drivers of this rampant proliferation of oil palm plantations in Southeast Asia is the desire for sustainable biofuels in Europe. Or rather, it was until very recently. Europe has long sought to replace their emissions-heavy diesel fuel with something a little more clean burning. Their solution was biofuels, chief of which was palm oil. Although the EU's cars appear to be less emissions-heavy with biofuels in use, the true consequences of their supposed environmentalism lay halfway across the world in razed forests and burned peatlands. So their sustainable fuel initiative was not really sustainable at all. As a result, the European Commission banned palm oil biofuel subsidies in March of 2019. While this is a step forward in slowing the boom of slash-and-burn oil palm plantations in Southeast Asia, it also means a strong blow to smallholder farmers reliant on the expanding palm oil industry. The Guardian interviewed 66-year-old oil palm farmer Hussein Mohammed, who decried the EU's choice to draw down their consumption of palm oil biofuels. He says, "I have spent all my money on the palm oil farm. I've recently planted new trees that will last for the next 25 years, and my whole family relies on this. It's how my kids afford to study." So while independent small farmers represent only a portion of oil palm production, with the rest being owned by much larger corporations, this decision could upend their livelihoods. In a sense, the EU's flip-flopping on palm oil has manufactured a boom and bust process for smaller farmers who've invested their future in palm oil plantations. The point here is this. Palm oil production is indeed tied to environmentally harmful practices like clear-cutting rainforests and draining and burning peatlands. And for that reason, our global consumption of palm oil needs to be minimized, or at least driven into a slower, more sustainable model that considers the environmental impacts of land use before tearing apart beneficial forests. However, extracting ourselves from this process is a complicated matter that can exact negative consequences on independent growers and wage laborers now dependent on the Southeast Asian palm oil production industry. As the primary consumers of this oil, Europe and the United States have driven the demand for and ultimately the reckless pace of palm oil production in Indonesia and Malaysia. As a result, simply banning palm oils is not enough. In an official statement, the World Wildlife Fund argues that rather than boycotting, working from within to establish environmental best practices for oil palm growers is the best way forward. There's definitely some truth to the statement, because when done right, oil palms can yield the highest amount of oil per acre of land. And if Western countries drastically decrease their demand for palm oil, that could bring harsh disaster for many now reliant on a Western thirst for the oil. Ultimately, the palm oil industry is now at the whims of economically and politically powerful countries, and is just one of many industries that sacrifices environmental health and the well-being of poor and marginalized communities in pursuit of profits. When it comes down to it, the problems of the palm oil industry are symptoms of a much larger problem, that there are countries who get to dictate global economies. And those countries don't operate on an ethic of environmental or social care, but rather one of domination and exploitation.
Okay, so we looked at the video about palm oil. Why is it unsustainable then? So if we're not running out of palm oil, the issue here is that the impact it's having. They're clearing all these forests, which are the natural habitat of other living species, and that's why they're becoming extinct. The way that they're burning the forests is also producing huge amounts of emissions and things like that. So we've got this huge contribution to the environment in a negative way. The second example is asbestos. So you've probably heard about this before, and I'm sure you've heard about the health issues that come with asbestos fibers. So the question is, why did we use this thing for so long if we know that it's dangerous?
More than 4,500 years ago, Finnish pottery makers discovered a stone made of thin fibers that mixed really well with the clay they used to make pots. This peculiar stone was so strong and yet flexible that they could use it to make their pots thinner and bigger than ever. Plus, it was surprisingly resistant to heat, so the pots could hold things like hot metal. It seemed like something of a miracle stone, and eventually the ancient Greeks and Romans and Egyptians all started using it too. That rock was what we now call asbestos, and eventually we found out that it was too good to be true and stopped using it so much, but that took a pretty long time. The word asbestos actually refers to 6 different minerals that all have the same habit, or way their crystals grow. They're called asbestiform, which just means that they grow in long, thin, flexible fibers. That flexibility, plus their strength and resistance to damage by heat and harsh chemicals, made these minerals incredibly useful in industry. The problem, of course, is that inhaling asbestos fibers can be dangerous because to your lungs, those flexible fibers are more like sharp little knives. You can probably imagine what happens if you breathe them in. They get stuck in the mucus lining of your lungs, which can make it difficult to breathe. Inhale too many of the shards over time and they cause diseases like asbestosis, or scarring of the lungs, and mesothelioma, a type of lung cancer.
So pretty nasty stuff, really, when we look at it. The question there is, why did we use it for so long? And I guess the issue is that it was such a useful product. So originally we didn't actually know that it was that bad, and then I'm sure for a period of time we had some suspicions, but we didn't know exactly, and it was so useful that we were kind of inclined to keep using it. But this is an example of an unsustainable product. So in this case, the harm that it was actually doing by using it was on us directly. Rather than harming another creature, we were actually harming ourselves by using a resource. So a duck hunter argues that because ducks are a renewable resource, hunting them must be sustainable. After all, they breed each year, so the ducks that are shot are quickly replaced. I want you to have a think about how would you explain to him that renewability and sustainability are not the same thing. So if you're having a debate with this guy, what would you say? So pause the video now before I give you some answers, and I want you to have a think about it. Maybe write something down as to how you would argue this point. There's 2 ways you could think about this. On the one hand, it is true that ducks are renewable because they breed each year. It's still possible to kill so many, though, that they cannot replace themselves. So just because it's renewable in the sense of it replaces, we could still overuse the product in the sense of killing it rather than actually consuming it. So each year there might be more ducks killed than there are being born, and then this would be a decrease in population, and this would be an unsustainable process. On the other hand, though, you might note that the removal of ducks from an ecosystem could also damage that ecosystem. Something else might already be eating ducks that depends on it, and the ducks may contribute to an ecosystem where perhaps their manure breaks down in the water and bacteria feeds on it and things like that. So without the ducks to eat this algae or produce these kind of bacteria or fertilizers, This could lead to other changes in species. We might lose the fish, the snail, the frogs, the algae. All of these things could be affected in the waterway. So it's not directly the ducks themselves, but it's the effect that the ducks have on the rest of the ecosystem that is now causing the harm. This concludes the lesson for today. There are no quizzes or questions for this one. It's a fairly lengthy lesson. Make sure you've taken notes on what we're talking about in terms of what is sustainability, what are some of the ways that we can define something to be sustainable or unsustainable. I'll see you next time.